Imagine you are sitting in an incident response war room.
Oh, that is never a fun place to be.
Right. It is 3 in the morning. Your executives are pacing the floor.
Sweating through their shirts.
Exactly. Federal regulators are already drafted on a conference call, and definitively that a highly sophisticated nation-state attacker has been inside your cloud environment for months.
Just a total nightmare scenario for any SOC analyst listening right now.
It really is. Because they have been reading executive emails. And then the auditor looks at you and asks one simple question. They ask, what exactly did they steal?
And that is the moment your stomach just drops.
It drops, because you have to look them dead in the eye and say, well, I have absolutely no idea because we didn't pay for the premium logging license.
Which is just a brutal reality to face.
It is brutal. So welcome to this deep dive into the research surrounding cloud forensics and incident response.
Glad to be here.
If you are a cloud architect, an auditor, a security engineer, or a SOC analyst currently in the trenches, you already know the pain of tracing an attacker through, ephemeral virtual machines and decentralized logs. It is a completely different beast than traditional on-premise forensics.
It is night and day, completely different skill set.
Right. So today, our mission is to dissect 3 of the most complex cloud breaches in history. We are talking about Capital One, SolarWinds, and the Microsoft Storm 0558 intrusion.
3 massive architecture-defining events.
Exactly. And we're going to connect those technical breakdowns to the brutal legal realities of preserving digital evidence in the cloud.
Because that legal piece is what actually matters when the dust settles.
Totally. So hello, everyone. The research we are poring over today is, frankly, incredibly dense, but it essentially acts as our forensic playbook for today.
We have a massive amount of ground to cover.
We really do. We are looking at everything from identity and access management misconfigurations to the granular mathematical complexities of the federal rules of evidence.
Yeah, bridging that crucial gap between the highly technical indicators of compromise and the very rigid legal standards required to prove what actually happened in a court of law.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the weeds of these specific and honestly terrifying attacks, we need to set the stage.
We have to lay out the foundation first.
Right. We really have to understand why the cloud completely shatters our traditional understanding of digital forensics.
It really does break everything we used to know.
It does. Because for decades, the paradigm was simple. A server was compromised, you walked into the data center, you physically pulled the hard drive.
Yeah, you plugged it into a write blocker, and you created a bit-for-bit forensic image. You had physical, tangible control over the evidence.
Tangible control, that is the key phrase. But now we're dealing with AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform. We are shifting from physical hard drives to highly distributed, abstract, shared environments.
And that shift is monumental. I mean, we are no longer dealing with standalone systems at all. We are operating within a massive abstraction layer.
Which is exactly what makes it so difficult.
Right. And the research we are looking at, specifically the NIST Cloud Computing Forensic Science Working Group, highlights this beautifully. They actually identified 65 distinct challenges for cloud forensics.
65? That is overwhelming.
It really is, and they're categorized across multiple domains. But the core of the issue really comes down to the architecture itself.
So break that down for us. What does that architectural challenge actually look like?
Well, think about it. When you spin up an EC2 instance or an Azure VM, you aren't getting a dedicated hard drive.
Right. You are not getting a physical spinning disk in a rack somewhere just for you.
Exactly. You are getting a virtualized slice of compute and storage that is physically striped across multiple platters in multiple server racks, and it's shared with potentially dozens of other organizations.
Which brings up a huge part of that architecture, which relies on what we call ephemeral resources.
Oh, the ephemeral nature of the cloud is the hardest part.
It really is.
Yeah.
And just a quick host note here for anyone listening who might be crossing over from the GRC or auditing side, who, might not be provisioning infrastructure every day.
Always get to define our terms.
Right. So ephemeral resources are virtual machines or containers that are designed to spin up and down dynamically based on demand. They exist only as long as they are needed.
Yeah, they are inherently temporary by design.
Exactly. When they are terminated, say, like when traffic scales down after a big e-commerce holiday sale, all of that volatile memory, all of those local logs that haven't been proactively exported to a central repository, they are simply destroyed.
Just wiped out entirely.
Yeah, the memory space is reallocated to another customer. They just vanish into the digital ether.
Which is a forensic investigator's absolute worst nightmare.
I can only imagine.
Seriously, you cannot pull memory forensics on a hypervisor that has already overwritten the data for another tenant's workload. It's gone.
And the NIST research breaks these hurdles down into critical areas, right?
Yeah, they categorize it. First is architecture, which includes dealing with that multi-tenancy and data segregation we just talked about.
Because your data is literally sitting on the same physical hardware as your competitors.
Exactly. Then there is data collection, which is navigating dynamic storage and the sheer lack of physical access. I mean, you are not plugging in a USB drive anymore.
Right. You are just making an API call and hoping the provider gives you what you need.
Exactly. Then you have analysis, which involves the absolute nightmare of correlating logs across different service providers.
Oh, especially in hybrid or multi-cloud setups?
Yeah, where timestamps might be slightly out of sync between AWS and Azure, it makes timeline recreation incredibly painful.
And then there is the legal side, right?
Yeah, the legal challenges, like dealing with cross-jurisdictional boundaries because, your S3 bucket might be replicated across physical data centers in 3 different sovereign nations simultaneously.
Wow. So depending on where the data physically sits at that millisecond, different laws apply. It is a massive web of complexity.
It is a jurisdictional nightmare.
And to try and bring some order to this chaos, the research points us to ISO AE 27037.
Yes, the international standard.
Right, the standard for the identification, collection, acquisition, and preservation of digital evidence. But applying this in the cloud is entirely dependent on cooperation from the cloud service providers, or CSPs.
You are at their mercy, essentially.
You really are. You are heavily reliant on the service level agreements, or SLAs, that your procurement team signed, like 3 years ago.
Yeah, those contracts govern your entire forensic capability.
Exactly. You might need API logs going back 90 days for an investigation, but if your SLA only guarantees 30 days of retention, well, you are completely out of luck.
What's fascinating here is how the shared responsibility model fundamentally alters the chain of custody.
Oh, the chain of custody. That is the holy grail of forensics.
Right, because in traditional forensics, the chain of custody is an unbroken sequence of physical possession. I hand you the drive, you sign the physical form.
You can physically track who held the evidence at every second.
Exactly. But in the cloud, you never actually possess the physical storage medium.
So how do you prove custody?
Well, you are relying entirely on the cloud provider's API to hand you the data, which introduces a massive layer of trust into a discipline that is supposed to be based entirely on verifiable mathematical proof.
It is a huge leap of faith. Think of it this way for everyone listening. If you are investigating a robbery in a standalone traditional bank vault, you own the building.
You control the whole perimeter.
Exactly. You control the security cameras, you lock the front door, you dust for fingerprints, and you know exactly who walked in and out. Traditional forensics gives you total environmental control.
Which is very comforting for an investigator.
It is. But cloud forensics, on the other hand, is like investigating a single safety deposit box inside a massive, constantly moving, decentralized vault.
A vault that shifts its shape every few minutes.
Exactly. You do not own the building. The building is shared with a million strangers. The bank manager holds the only master set of security logs, and they will only give you the logs that pertain strictly to your little box.
And that's assuming you ask for them before the security tape loop overwrites itself?
Right. If you are a day late, the tape is gone. That is a perfect visualization of the problem.
And it really highlights the friction between operational efficiency and forensic necessity.
Because they are basically opposites.
They are. The cloud is designed for speed, scale, and elasticity. You want things to move fast and break down when they aren't needed to save money.
But forensics requires the exact opposite.
Right. Forensics requires preservation, isolation, and meticulous documentation. Those two paradigms are inherently at odds.
But wait, let me jump in here. We hear the term forensic readiness thrown around constantly in boardroom presentations and vendor pitches.
Whoa, it's the buzzword of the year.
It really is. But how does a SOC team actually prepare for an environment that is quite literally designed to disappear the moment it stops being utilized? How do you establish readiness in a void?
That is the exact question that keeps incident responders awake at night. And I really want to pause and acknowledge the intense pressure that SOC analysts face in these moments.
It is a genuinely stressful job.
It is. I mean, imagine being in the hot seat. Your management is standing over your shoulder, demanding a timeline of the breach, asking exactly what customer data was exfiltrated.
Right. They want answers right now.
And you have to turn around and tell them that you simply don't know. Because the cloud provider's default log retention was only 30 days, the ephemeral container was destroyed a week ago, and the local logs died with it.
It is a deeply helpless feeling.
It really is. Forensic readiness in the cloud doesn't mean having a write blocker in your desk drawer anymore.
So what does it mean practically?
It means architecting your cloud environment from day zero to proactively stream every conceivable log, metric, and state change to an immutable, centrally isolated storage bucket that the primary environment cannot overwrite.
So it's an architectural commitment, not just an incident response toolset.
Exactly. It has to be built in from the start.
And that transition from a reactive toolset to a proactive architecture brings us to our first major case study.
This is a big one.
It is. We need to look at a very concrete, very painful example where cloud misconfigurations led to catastrophic data exfiltration. We were talking about the Capital One breach of 2019.
Yes, this is a watershed moment in cloud security history.
It changed everything about how we view cloud security.
It really did. The research we are analyzing, particularly the comprehensive case study from MIT Sloan, points out that this wasn't an attack relying on a highly sophisticated zero-day exploit.
Right. It wasn't some unknown magic trick.
No, this was an attack that preyed entirely on the systemic complexities of a modern cloud architecture.
Let's lay out the facts for everyone listening. This incident occurred between March and July of 2019.
A pretty wide window.
Yeah, and the sheer scale is staggering. 106 million customers affected across the U.S. and Canada.
It's just a massive amount of PII.
Huge. The attacker walked away with 30 gigabytes of data, which equated to roughly 700 S3 buckets worth of highly sensitive credit application information.
And the really interesting part is who the attacker was.
Right. The attacker wasn't a shadowy foreign syndicate. It was Paige Thompson, a former AWS software engineer who possessed deep insider knowledge of exactly how these cloud architectures are wired.
And that insider knowledge was the absolute key to pulling this off.
Because she knew exactly where the weak points were.
Exactly. The research outlines 5 distinct control failures that had to align perfectly for this attack to succeed.
So it wasn't just one mistake.
No, it was a cascade of systemic flaws. First, there was a misconfigured reverse proxy, specifically an open-source mod security web application firewall.
Okay, so a WAF that wasn't locked down. What was the second failure?
Second, there was a fundamental weakness in the AWS EC2 instance metadata service, which allowed for a server-side request forgery vulnerability.
The dreaded SSRF. We will definitely need to dig into that one.
We will. Third, there was a severely over-provisioned IAM role attached to that firewall.
Right, giving it way too much permission.
Fourth, there was inadequate encryption, meaning the attacker was able to acquire the specific privileges needed to actually decrypt and read the data.
So the data wasn't just sitting there in plain text, but they found the keys to unlock it.
Exactly. And fifth, there was a complete lack of adequate intrusion detection or prevention systems to catch the anomaly as it was happening.
No alarms went off.
None.
Let's break down that second point, because that is the absolute linchpin of the whole operation. We need to talk about the SSRF.
It's a classic cloud attack vector.
So, host note time for our listeners. SSRF stands for Server-Side Request Forgery. It is an attack where the adversary abuses the functionality of a server to force it to access or modify internal resources that are otherwise strictly protected from the outside network.
Basically tricking the server into doing your dirty work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how did this actually play out at the packet level in the Capital One environment?
It was a brilliantly simple manipulation of trust. In AWS, virtual machines, or EC2 instances, need a way to know about themselves.
Right. They need some self-awareness to function in the cloud.
Exactly. They need to know their IP address, their host name, and most importantly, they need a way to pull their temporary security credentials to interact with other AWS services.
Otherwise, they can't talk to the database or storage.
Right. So AWS provides this via the Instance Metadata Service, or IMDS, which lives at a highly specific, non-routable internal IP address. That address is 169.254.169.254.
That is an IP address every cloud engineer has burned into their brain.
Oh, absolutely. And the key here is that only the EC2 instance itself is supposed to be able to talk to that address.
Right. It's basically the server asking the cloud, hey, who am I and what am I allowed to do today?
Precisely. But here is the technical breakdown of the attack. The attacker found a misconfiguration in Capital One's web application firewall.
The WebF we mentioned earlier.
Right. Because the YF was acting as a reverse proxy, it was designed to take incoming web requests and forward them along to the backend servers.
That's its whole job.
Yeah. But the attacker crafted a malicious HTTP request that essentially told the WEF, hey, I need you to go fetch the data located at 169.254.169.254.
So they told the external-facing firewall to query its own internal metadata service.
Exactly. And the WEF, due to that SSRF vulnerability, processed that request, turned around, and reached out to that internal metadata IP address on the attacker's behalf.
Wow.
And because this was using the older IMDS version 1, the metadata service didn't require a special authentication token to answer the request.
So it just blindly trusted the request.
It did. It just saw a request coming from the authorized firewall instance, assumed it was legitimate local traffic, and happily handed over the temporary security credentials associated with that machine.
And here is where it gets so much worse. Those temporary credentials belong to an IAM role.
The keys to the kingdom.
Yeah. Another quick host note here. IAM is Identity and Access Management. It's the framework of policies and technologies that ensures the right users and devices have the appropriate access to technology resources.
It is the absolute core of cloud security.
If you control IAM, you control the cloud. Period.
And this brings us to the third control failure, the over-provision IAM role.
Right, because getting the credentials is one thing, but what those credentials can actually do is another.
Exactly. The role attached to that firewall, the role that the WAF assumed to do its job, wasn't just scoped to do basic firewall things.
It should have just been able to inspect traffic and write log.
Right, but it had incredibly broad permissions. It had the ability to list all S3 buckets in the environment and read the contents of those buckets.
Why would a firewall ever need to read credit application buckets?
It shouldn't. So when the attacker extracted those temporary credentials via the SSRF, she essentially inherited the identity of the firewall, along with all those excessive permissions.
Here's where it gets really interesting when we step back and look at the broader implications.
Yeah, the macro view of this is fascinating.
When we look at the MIT research, they apply something called the cyber safety method.
I love this framework.
Me too. This framework argues that we shouldn't just look at this as a technical glitch or a bad line of code in a firewall. It was a massive systems problem.
Here's an organizational failure, really.
Exactly. The researchers argue that Capital One, despite being heralded as a pioneer in enterprise cloud adoption, suffered from a checkbox mentality.
They were checking the compliance boxes without seeing the big picture.
Right. They relied heavily on standard vendor guidance and individual component security without deeply understanding how those components interacted with one another dynamically.
That is the crux of the cyber safety method. I mean, if you look at it in isolation, a WAF is a good security control.
Obviously, you want a WAF.
And if you look at it in isolation, assigning an IMM role to an EC2 instance instead of hard-coding static access keys is a good security control.
That's best practice.
It is. But when a vulnerable WAF is combined with an overly permissive IMM role, the interaction between those two supposedly secure components creates a catastrophic vulnerability.
It's the interaction that's dangerous.
Think about it like giving the front desk receptionist at a high-security corporate facility a master P card.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Sure, the receptionist needs a key card to open the front door for guests. That's their job. But you absolutely do not give them a key card that also opens the server room, the bank vault, and the CEO's private office.
Because if the receptionist gets compromised, the whole building falls.
Exactly. By giving the WAF access to query virtually any S3 bucket in the environment, Capital One gave the receptionist the master keys to the entire enterprise.
But I have to stop you there because I know every cloud architect listening is screaming at their dashboard right now.
I can hear them through the mic.
Capital One was famous for their tech talent. They were the poster child for AWS adoption. If they were considered this massive, cloud-savvy enterprise, how does a glaringly vulnerable reverse proxy with root-level access just get shipped to production?
Oh, it's a fair question.
Was this simply a case of prioritizing deployment speed over security validation?
The research suggests that it very likely was a cultural prioritization of speed and agility over rigorous systems testing.
I move fast and break things.
Exactly. When you adopt a heavy DevOps culture, the primary metric of success is often rapid, continuous deployment.
Getting features pushed out as fast as possible.
Right. If security is viewed as a gatekeeper or a hurdle rather than an integrated part of the engineering pipeline, you get these latent flaws.
Because security slows down the deployment pipeline.
Yeah. It wasn't that the engineers were malicious or incompetent. It's that the organizational structure and the informational feedback loops failed to recognize the emergent hazard.
The silos were too deep.
Precisely. The team deploying the wave likely didn't talk to the team configuring the IAM roles, and neither team realized what would happen if the two overlapped.
It is a painful lesson that in the cloud, component-level security is entirely insufficient. You have to model the threats of the entire system's interaction.
You have to look at the whole blast radius.
That systems-level failure at Capital One is a perfect bridge to something even more insidious.
Oh, we are moving into the deep end now.
We really are.
Yeah.
Capital One was a direct assault on a misconfigured cloud component. But what happens when the cloud identity itself, the very concept of trust, is compromised via an on-premise supply chain?
Yeah, when the trust boundary is completely erased.
Exactly. We need to talk about the SolarWinds attack of 2020.
This is where the forensic landscape shifts from complicated to truly labyrinthine.
It is a maze.
It is. The SolarWinds breach fundamentally changed how the intelligence community and enterprise security teams view the intersection of on-premise networks and cloud environments.
Let's lay out the facts on this one. The attack was executed by a highly sophisticated, advanced persistent threat group known as APT-29 or Cozy Bear.
A very well-known, very capable threat actor.
Right. And the research we are referencing attributes this group to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. And to be clear to our listeners, we are impartially reporting the attributions found in the research provided. We are simply laying out the facts as documented by the forensic investigators.
Understood. And the vector they chose was brilliant in its stealth.
It really was.
They didn't attack the 18,000 victim organizations directly.
Which would have been noisy and easily detected.
Right. Instead, they compromised the software build pipeline of SolarWinds, a company that provides network monitoring software called Orion.
So they went upstream to the supplier.
Exactly. By injecting a backdoor, known as Sunburst, into the legitimate software updates, the attackers were effectively invited into the most secure, highly privileged areas of thousands of enterprise and government networks.
Right, because a network monitoring tool inherently needs deep, pervasive access to see everything that is going on across the infrastructure.
It has to have the keys to see the traffic.
It's the ultimate Trojan horse. But while the initial infection was on-premise, the ultimate prize and the focus of our cloud forensics deep dive today was the cloud dimension.
Yes, the pivot to the cloud.
This is where we have to talk about the Golden Samuel attack.
This is an absolute masterclass in lateral movement and identity subversion.
Break it down for us.
Once the attackers established a foothold on the on-premise network via the Sunburst backdoor, they didn't just stay there.
They weren't just looking around local servers.
No, they moved laterally to the organization's Active Directory infrastructure. Their goal was to extract a very specific cryptographic asset.
And what was that asset?
It was the private key used by the Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS.
Okay, let's pause and explain the mechanics of that for the audience. In a hybrid environment, companies don't want their users to have to log in separately to their local computer and then log in again to their Microsoft 365 email in the cloud.
Right. Users hate having 50 different passwords.
Exactly. So they use federated identity. The on-premise ADFS acts as the identity provider. When a user wants to access the cloud, ADFS verifies who they are, usually checking their password and multi-factor authentication.
The standard local checks.
Right. Then, ADFS generates a digitally signed XML document, a SAML assertion that basically says, hey, I vouch for this user, they are who they say they are, and they have these specific roles.
It's like a digital passport.
Perfect analogy. The cloud service, like Azure AD, sees the token, verifies the digital signature against the public key it has on file, and grants access.
Exactly. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, by stealing the ADFS private key from the on-premise server, the attackers could now cryptographically sign their own SAML tokens entirely offline.
They could just mint their own passport.
Exactly. They could forge a token claiming to be the CEO or the global domain administrator or anyone else.
With no actual authentication happen.
Right. And because the token was signed with the perfectly legitimate stolen private key, the cloud environment, whether it was Microsoft 365, Exchange Online, or Azure AD, accepted it without question.
It bypasses traditional cloud authentication completely. It doesn't matter if you have incredibly complex passwords, right?
Doesn't matter at all.
It doesn't matter if you have strict multi-factor authentication enabled,
Nope, the MFA is completely bypassed.
because the golden SAML token essentially tells the cloud, hey, I already did the password check and the MFA on-premise. Here is the cryptographically soundproof. Just let me in.
And forensically, this is devastating.
I can imagine. How do you track that?
It's incredibly difficult. Because the tokens were perfectly forged, they survived, even if the victim organization completely wiped and remediated their on-premise environment.
Wait, really? So you could clean up the initial breach entirely and they are still in?
Yes. You could burn your local Active Directory to the ground and rebuild it from scratch, but if you didn't remember to rotate that SAML signing certificate in the cloud, the attacker still had a persistent, completely undetected backdoor directly into the cloud tenant.
It is terrifying.
It demonstrates how hybrid cloud architectures create devastating trust bridges. You can have the most secure cloud environment in the world, but if you implicitly trust an on-premise identity provider and that provider is compromised, your cloud is compromised.
This brings us to the massive forensic gap highlighted in the research.
Yes, the visibility gap.
When the breach was finally discovered, and ironically, this is because the security firm FireEye noticed an employee's account had a new MFA device enrolled that the employee didn't recognize.
Yeah, a tiny operational slip-up by the attackers?
Right. So when it was discovered, the incident response team scrambled to figure out what the attackers actually did in the cloud. They knew the attackers were inside the email tenants, but proving exactly which emails they accessed was incredibly difficult.
This is where we run headfirst into the reality of cloud logging and commercial licensing.
The business side of forensics.
Exactly. To prove exactly what an attacker read in Microsoft 365, investigators desperately needed the mail items access log.
Okay, what does that log actually do?
This specific telemetry records every single time a mailbox item is accessed via the Exchange Online API. It tracks the bind operations and the sync operations.
So it tells you exactly what was touched.
Yes, it is the definitive forensic artifact for this type of API-driven data exfiltration.
But there was a catch, right? A massive, incredibly frustrating catch for these organizations.
A massive catch. The mail items access log was only available to customers who paid for the premium advanced audit licensing tier.
Oh.
Yeah, which was typically bundled into the very expensive E5 enterprise license. Many victim organizations, including several high-level U.S. government agencies, were running on standard E3 or lower licensing tiers.
So they just didn't have the data.
They simply did not have the logs being generated. The telemetry didn't exist for them.
I've sat in those chairs, and it is a gut-wrenching feeling. Just take a second, everyone listening, and imagine being the incident commander on that call.
Sweating bullets.
You are sitting in the war room. You have board members and federal regulators demanding answers. You know definitively that an advanced nation-state actor has been inside your environment for months.
You know they are in there.
You know they used forged tokens to access your executive email accounts. And when the auditors ask you, what exactly did they read? What state secrets or intellectual property did they steal?
The worst question to get.
You have to look them in the eye and say, I literally cannot prove it because we didn't pay for the premium logging license. That is a career-ending, soul-crushing moment.
It really highlights a brutal truth about the cloud. Forensics is a paid feature.
Forensics is a paid feature. That is a quote for a t-shirt right there.
It was such a profound failure of visibility that it actually prompted the U.S. Congress and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, to mandate that these advanced auditing capabilities be provided to federal agencies at no additional cost moving forward.
Wow, so it literally changed federal policy.
Yes. The forensic gap was quite literally deemed a national security vulnerability.
So let me ask the hard question here. Does this mean our reliance on SAML and federated identity is fundamentally flawed? Or is the failure strictly in how we monitor for authentication anomalies?
It is not that SAML is inherently broken. The cryptography itself holds up. You can't break the math.
Right, the math is solid.
The failure is in the architectural assumption of absolute trust. We built hybrid clouds on the premise that the on-premise perimeter was secure and that the identity provider was infallible.
And SolarWinds proved that assumption totally false?
Exactly. The lesson here is that you cannot rely solely on the token signature. You must monitor the behavior of the token itself.
So, behavioral analytics.
Yes. The research notes that the Golden SAML technique left distinctive forensic traces in Azure AD sign-in logs. There were anomalies in how the tokens were used, from what IP addresses, at what times, and targeting which APIs.
So the clues were there if you knew how to look for them.
If organizations had robust user and entity behavior analytics, or UEBA, they might have detected the anomalous usage of the tokens long before the supply chain compromise was ever made public.
Okay, so SolarWinds involved stealing a private key from a customer's on-premise environment to forge access to the cloud.
Right, an on-prem to cloud pivot.
But what happens when the attackers bypass the customer entirely? What happens when they steal the master key directly from the cloud provider itself?
Oh, this is the big one.
This brings us to the Microsoft Storm 0558 intrusion in 2023.
If Capital One was a misconfiguration and SolarWinds was a supply chain compromise, Storm 0558 represents the ultimate nightmare scenario.
It is the boss level of cloud breaches.
It is a cryptographic compromise of the cloud service provider's own core infrastructure.
Let's lay out the timeline from the research. May 2023. The threat actor is tracked as Storm-0558. Again, imparting the research findings objectively, U.S. intelligence agencies attributed this group to China's Ministry of State Security, or MSS.
Impartially noted, yes.
The target was incredibly precise. They accessed the email accounts of approximately 25 organizations globally, including high-level officials within the U.S. State Department.
Very surgical targeting.
And they did this by exploiting an inactive Microsoft Service account, or MSA, consumer signing key, that dated all the way back to 2016.
The technical mechanics of this are absolutely astounding.
It really is wild.
The attackers managed to acquire this inactive MSA key. Now, this key was designed strictly to sign consumer tokens. Think your personal Outlook.com or Xbox Live account.
Right. Totally segregated from the enterprise stuff.
It was never, ever supposed to have any authority over enterprise Azure AD or corporate Exchange Online environments. Those are supposed to be completely separate trust domains.
So how did they cross that boundary?
The attackers discovered a critical code validation error within Microsoft's authentication systems.
How did that validation error actually work under the hood? I know our audience wants the deep technical explanation.
It came down to how the OpenID Connect, or OIDC, metadata was processed. Microsoft's system had a flaw where the metadata endpoint for the enterprise system improperly accepted the consumer signing key's public certificate as a valid issuer.
Wait, so the enterprise system just looked at a consumer key and said, yeah, sure, come on in.
Essentially, yes. The validation logic checked if the signature itself was mathematically valid, which it was because the attackers had the real key.
Right, it was a legitimate signature.
But the logic failed to properly check the scope and the issuer constraints. It failed to say, wait a minute, this is a consumer key trying to access a highly classified enterprise email tenant.
It checked the math, but not the context.
Exactly. This flaw essentially forced the enterprise systems to improperly trust and validate tokens signed by this consumer key.
So they used a stolen consumer key to mint perfectly valid enterprise access tokens. It's almost hard to wrap your head around the severity of that.
It is the equivalent of stealing the cryptographic crown jewels. When you compromise a cloud service provider's signing key, you completely bypass the customer's entire security apparatus.
Literally everything you built as a defender is bypassed.
Every single thing. The customer's MFA, their conditional access policies, their complex passwords, their VPNs, none of it matters because the attacker is presenting a token that the cloud provider's own infrastructure cryptographically swears is 100% valid.
It underscores the massive centralized risk we accept when moving to the cloud.
It really does. We are shifting the burden of managing non-human identities like API keys, service accounts, and signing certificates entirely to the provider. And as this research points out, non-human identity management is the new perimeter.
And how is this actually detected? Because this is where the irony really sets in.
Oh, the irony is thick on this one.
It wasn't detected by Microsoft's internal alarms. It was detected by a U.S. federal agency looking at their own logs. And not just any logs. They detected it by spotting anomalous client app-ID usage within the mail items accessed logs.
Which are the exact same premium logs that everyone was missing during the SolarWinds breach.
It is an incredible full-circle moment in forensic history. The State Department had the E5 licensing, they had the logs, they were actively threat hunting, and they noticed that the client app-ID associated with the access requests didn't match the expected normal behavior for their users.
Right. The API calls were coming from applications that shouldn't have been accessing those mailboxes.
So they flagged the anomaly to Microsoft, which kicked off the massive internal investigation.
And the tooling the attackers used was highly customized. The research details that Storm 0558 utilized a collection of Python and PowerShell scripts, making specific Outlook web app REST API calls like get conversation items to quietly siphon off the emails.
They weren't using a web browser. They were automating the theft via API.
Exactly. They had hard-coded bearer tokens in their scripts, and they routed all their traffic through Tor and a network of soft ether SOKS5 proxies to mask their origin.
The proxy infrastructure is a key point here.
It vastly complicates the forensic attribution and detection. They weren't coming from known bad IP addresses. They were cycling through dedicated servers configured specifically for token replay. They kept their footprint incredibly low.
So what does this all mean for the timeline? Here is where it gets really frightening.
Yeah, the timeline is the scariest part.
The research indicates that the breach was detected in mid-June, and the activity tracked back to May 15th. But Microsoft's standard log retention policy is 30 days.
Right.
Does that mean the attackers could have been in there for months or even years, and the evidence simply aged out?
That is the grim reality of cloud forensics. Microsoft's subsequent investigation suggested the actor might have been in possession of that signing key since April 2021.
Over 2 years.
Yeah, possibly acquiring it from a crash dump that was improperly moved to an internet-connected debugging environment. But because of standard log retention practices, the definitive forensic trail within the customer tenants prior to mid-May 2023 was largely gone.
You cannot investigate what has been deleted.
Exactly. It is a stark reminder that storage costs are cheap. But the cost of not having logs during a breach is incalculable.
To give our security pros another analogy to visualize this token forgery error, think of a bouncer at an incredibly exclusive VIP club.
Okay, I'm listening.
The bouncer has a digital barcode scanner to check IDs. The attacker walks up and hands the bouncer an expired public library card from 2016. But because the software in the bouncer's scanner was programmed incorrectly, it reads the library card, flashes green, and tells the bouncer, yes, this person is the VIP owner of the club, let them into the vault.
The bouncer isn't malicious. The bouncer is just implicitly trusting a flawed validation system.
Exactly. That is exactly what happened at the code level. The system trusted the cryptographic signature without properly validating the scope, the context, and the intent of the key itself.
It's a perfect analogy for OIDC validation failures.
So here is my pushback, and the question every SOC analyst is asking right now.
Bring it on.
If an incredibly sophisticated state-sponsored actor is operating with hard-coded soft ether proxies, moving low and slow, and using perfectly forged tokens signed by the vendor's own master key, how can a standard enterprise SOC analyst ever hope to catch them without relying entirely on the CSP to tell them they are breached?
It is the hardest question in cloud security today. You cannot rely on traditional signature-based detection because the signatures look entirely legitimate.
The math says they are valid.
Right. The only way to detect this is through rigorous, heavily tuned behavioral analysis. You have to establish a pristine baseline of what normal API interaction looks like for your environment.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, you need to know which user agents normally access Exchange online, from which geographical regions, at what volume. When a Python script using a hard-coded token starts pulling down thousands of get conversation items via an API endpoint that the user normally only accesses via the Outlook web client on their laptop, that is the behavioral anomaly you have to alert on.
It's not about the token. It's about how the token is behaving.
Exactly. But it requires a maturity in SIME tuning and UEBA that many organizations simply haven't reached yet.
Which is a sobering thought. But let's pivot, because detecting the attacker is really only half the battle.
It's just the beginning, honestly.
We've spent this entire time talking about how attackers manipulate the cloud and how investigators find the breadcrumbs. But finding the breadcrumbs doesn't matter if you can't present them in a court of law.
If you can't prove it to a judge, it didn't happen.
Exactly. Once you detect the breach, how do you collect that digital evidence so it holds up to aggressive legal scrutiny or regulatory hearings? This brings us to the final massive hurdle: the chain of custody and legal admissibility in the cloud.
This is where the rubber meets the road. In traditional forensics, the chain of custody is paramount. It is the documented, unbroken sequence of possession and control of evidence from the moment it is collected to the moment it is presented in court.
It's a paper trail of physical possession.
Right. If there is a gap in that chain, if there is any doubt about who had access to the evidence, opposing counsel will have it thrown out immediately.
But, as we discussed in the beginning, how do you prove an unbroken chain of physical custody for a log file that was dynamically generated in a multi-tenant Azure data center and transmitted to your CM via an API.
It requires a completely different legal framework. And the research points us directly to the Federal Rules of Evidence, or FRE, specifically Amendments 902.13 and 902.14.
These are absolute game changers for digital forensics.
They really are. They allow for digital evidence to be self-authenticating.
This is a crucial evolution, because prior to these amendments, if you wanted to introduce a cloud log or a forensic image of an AWS environment into evidence, you generally had to produce a sponsoring witness.
An expensive, highly credentialed forensic expert.
Right. Who would take the stand, swear an oath, and verbally walk the jury through the exact technical process of how the evidence was collected to prove it was authentic.
It was slow, it was incredibly expensive, and it bogged down the legal system immensely. Juries do not want to sit through 3 hours of API collection methodology.
But 902.13 and 902.14 changed that. Now, if you collect the data correctly, you don't need the live expert witness to testify to its foundation. The evidence speaks for itself.
But the key phrase there is, if you collect the data correctly.
Absolutely. The mechanics of this self-authentication rely entirely on two things: hash values and metadata.
Let's break those down.
Just a quick host note on hash values as a refresher for anyone who needs it. A hash value is a fixed-length string of numbers and letters generated by a mathematical algorithm, like SHA-1 or SHA-256, based on the digital contents of a file.
It acts as a digital fingerprint.
Exactly. It is deterministic, meaning the exact same file will always produce the exact same hash. It's collision-resistant, meaning it's virtually impossible for two different files to produce the same hash.
And most importantly, any tiny change to the file, even adding a single space at the end of a log line, alters the output hash completely.
Right. Rule 902.14 specifically deals with data copied from an electronic device, storage medium, or file. The official committee notes for the amendment explicitly state that identical hash values for the original and the copy reliably attest to the fact that they are exact duplicates.
So if your forensic analyst can produce a written certification stating they collected the cloud log via an API, generated a SHA-256 hash immediately upon collection, and that hash matches the hash of the file presented in court, the judge accepts it as authentic.
And the second pillar of this is metadata.
The data about data.
The research emphasizes that when dealing with cloud evidence, especially things like social media posts, web application logs, or API telemetry, you need the client metadata.
Like the browser OS and IP address.
Right. You need the web server or API endpoint metadata like the URL, the HTTP headers, the exact timestamps of the request and response down to the millisecond. And you need the account and message metadata.
This ties directly into ISO 27050, which is the international standard for electronic discovery, or e-discovery.
And e-discovery is the formal process of identifying, preserving, collecting, and analyzing electronically stored information for legal proceedings.
ISO 27050 mandates rigorous, documented processes to ensure the data is collected in a defensible manner that preserves all of that metadata immutably.
Which brings up a massive point of failure I see all the time in the field.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
So many times I see a junior analyst find a suspicious entry in a cloud console, and their immediate reaction is to just highlight the text, hit Windows copy and paste, and drop it into a Word document.
It makes me cringe every time.
Or worse, they just take a screenshot of the Splunk dashboard and attach it to a Jira ticket.
And by doing that, they have just completely destroyed the legal admissibility of that evidence. This raises an important question about whether your current incident response toolkit is actually legally defensible. When you take a screenshot or copy and paste text, you destroy the original metadata.
The created date becomes the moment you took the screenshot, not the moment the event occurred in the cloud.
Furthermore, a screenshot cannot generate a valid hash value of the underlying raw data. The research explicitly states that these are not forensically sound practices. If you take that screenshot to court, opposing counsel will absolutely eviscerate it.
Taking a screenshot of a critical cloud log is exactly like a detective walking onto a murder scene, seeing the weapon on the floor, and instead of carefully placing it into a sterile evidence bag with gloves, they just take a blurry Polaroid picture of it and leave the gun behind.
That is a great visual.
You completely lose the fingerprints, which is your metadata, and you lose the chemical residue, which is your hash value. The picture might prove a gun was in the room at that specific moment, but it will never, ever hold up in court as the weapon used.
That is a very visceral but highly accurate analogy, and it leads to a fascinating legal speculation regarding how courts view this evidence. The research discusses the philosophical divide in the legal community, often referred to as the Maryland approach versus the Texas approach.
Oh, this is fascinating. Break that down for us. What is the difference?
Well, the Maryland approach applies a very high burden of proof on the party trying to admit the digital evidence. The court essentially approaches the evidence with extreme skepticism, assuming that digital data is easily falsified or manipulated by third parties.
So you were guilty until proven innocent as far as the data goes.
Exactly. You have to affirmatively disprove that someone else could have altered the cloud logs before the judge will even let the jury look at it.
And what about the Texas approach?
On the other hand, the Texas approach places a much lower bar. It operates on a reasonable juror standard. You just need to provide enough circumstantial or direct evidence that a reasonable person would believe it is authentic.
That seems much more practical.
It is. Once you meet that lower bar, the evidence is admitted, and the burden shifts to the opposing counsel to actually prove it was manipulated.
So how do the new FRE amendments impact this divide?
FRE 902, 13, and 14 theoretically align more with making the submission easier, moving past the strict hurdles of the Maryland approach if you have the technical prerequisites like hashes.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
There is always a catch. This is the crucial extrapolation. By making it easier to submit evidence without a live witness, the rules actually increase the likelihood that opposing counsel will aggressively attack your collection methods long before the trial begins.
Because they can't attack the witness, they attack the tool.
Exactly. They know the evidence is self-authenticating once certified, so their only defense is to attack the certification process itself. They will demand to know exactly what software you used to collect the API logs, whether the software was legally validated, whether the metadata was preserved immutably, and whether your hash algorithms are cryptographically sound.
So relying on a slapdash collection of CSV exports manually downloaded from an AWS console isn't going to cut it anymore.
Not a chance.
You need specialized, defensible collection tools that automate the hashing and metadata preservation the exact second the API call is made.
Precisely. The days of ad hoc evidence collection in the cloud are over. If you anticipate any legal or regulatory fallout from an incident, and under modern SEC regulations, GDPR or IPA, you almost always should. Your collection mechanisms must be forensically sound by design.
This has been an absolutely staggering journey through the realities of cloud forensics.
It really is a massive topic.
We've gone from the theoretical paradigm shift of ephemeral architectures through the cascading systems failure at Capital One, into the terrifying supply chain and identity subversion of SolarWinds, straight into the cryptographic heart attack of the Microsoft Storm 0558 breach.
A wild ride.
And we wrapped it all in the strict, unforgiving reality of the federal rules of evidence and chain of custody. The cloud accelerates our business, it allows us to scale globally in seconds, but we have to acknowledge that it also dramatically accelerates the adversaries and complicates the legal aftermath to an unprecedented degree.
It really does. And I want to leave the listener with a final provocative thought to mull over. We mentioned it briefly at the beginning, but I want to re-emphasize the concept of forensic readiness.
It's so critical.
It is not merely an incident response capability you pull off the shelf during an emergency. It is a fundamental architectural discipline. You cannot wait for the breach to figure out how to capture an ephemeral container's memory or how to export an API log with its metadata intact.
By then it's too late.
Exactly. Forensic readiness means architecting your cloud environment from day one so that when a breach happens, the logs already exist, the retention period is legally sufficient, and the chain of custody is automated via hashing. What if we started treating our security log pipelines with the exact same critical security posture, funding, and engineering rigor as we do our primary production databases? Because on the worst day of your career, those logs are the only truth you will have left.
The logs are the only truth left. Thanks for tuning into InfoSec Bytes. Keep exploring our 100-plus episodes on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. Please like, subscribe. We are on various platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and share to stay connected and keep your cyber defenses strong. See you in the next episode. Stay tuned.
Here's a question for you to take back to your team today. If your cloud environment was breached an hour ago and the attacker used a forged identity token to access your data, do you currently have the specific logging and licensing tier required to prove exactly what they took? Think about it, and we'll see you next time.